Okay, well, first of all, if you could introduce yourself
Yeah.
and your name and the organization you represent.
Sure. My name is Matt Vespa, and I'm with the Center for Biological Diversity in the United States.
Okay, and you're talking about something called the gigaton gap.
Gigaton gap.
The gigaton gap.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, if you remember back to Copenhagen, there were some pledges made at the sort of last minute where some countries wrote down what they were going to, sort of their ambitions for reductions. And so the gigaton gap refers to the gap in those relatively low ambitions and the emission reductions science demands that we make to limit global warming to a safe level, which a majority, over 100 countries agree, is 1.5 degrees Celsius. But you could also look at it at a 2 degrees Celsius rise, which would have much more catastrophic impacts. But regardless of how you look at it, the gigaton gap is the gap between the ambition countries have pledged and where we actually need to go to keep a safe planet.
And what are you doing, or what can be done to bridge that gap?
Well, first, presented last week, the United Nations Environmental Program, the UNEP, did a report analyzing the gigaton gap, and they found that it was, depending on how you account for the pledges and what assumptions you make, it was anywhere between 5 and 9 gigatons. And that's a lot. 5 gigatons is the emissions from all cars, trucks, and buses in the world in 2005. 7 gigatons, we're talking about a 5 to 9 range. 7 gigatons is all the emissions from China in a year. So it's a big gap. And the UNEP report did identify a number of things we could do to close that gap. For example, there's an issue being discussed in the conference about LULUCF, the land use forestry rules. If the accounting was made strict and there weren't loopholes, we can close the gap by a certain amount. Options for international finance being discussed about taxing bunkers, which are planes and ships. Using that money to invest in adaptation and mitigation could result in more reductions. And of course, higher ambition pledges by developed countries would go a long way to closing the gap.
Right, and there's plenty that could be done and should be done. What is the likelihood of things actually being done, given some of the obstacles, the reticence on the part of some of the developed countries?
Right, well, I think the report is really sort of an alarm call about what needs to be done. And so certainly here in Cancun, there's things that can be done. With regard to the land use accounting rules, the report is very clear. We need very strict rules, so there's no gamesmanship. Yet it seems like the parties are on the verge of adopting rules that do allow for loopholes and gamesmanship. So, we're going in the exact opposite direction of what this United Nations report says. So certainly we can, have strict accounting rules there. We can do that here. I think also when we're talking about the mitigation for within the International Climate Agreement, there needs to be an acknowledgement, first of all, by the parties that the gap exists, which so far there has not been, and then a process to identify measures to close it by next year's COP. So let's acknowledge this thing exists and set forth an analysis of pledges, what they mean, and what types of steps we need to take to close it by next year so we can move toward an effective, legally binding climate agreement.
And realistically, what do you hope to see at the end of this week here in Cancun?
Well, realistically, I think to sort of call Cancun at least a way forward, not a total failure. I think what we need to see is first an acknowledgement within the shared vision section of the text that our aim for the climate agreement is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is needed to preserve coral reefs and prevent the flooding of islands and so forth. And then within the mitigation section, acknowledge the gap exists and set forth a process to close it. And that can be worked on throughout this year. I think also adopting loopholes, like they seem poised to do, is really going to undermine our ability to reduce emissions to the extent we need to. And that's a big concern.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sure. You happy? Covered everything?